Welcome back to Built in Ohio, a podcast that talks with and about Ohio technology. There's so much happening in our state that's exciting, and there's so much momentum. We have one of those leaders today that we are going to welcome, and I'll do that introduction now. But we have Dr. Timothy J. Miller, who is the CEO, president, and co-founder of Forge Biologics Incorporated, a VC-backed gene therapy development engine focused on accelerating access to potentially life-saving AAV gene therapies. He was previously the founding CEO and president of another therapeutics company, a rare disease NASDAQ gene and cell therapy company. And Dr. Miller is a proven biotech leader with experience in driving gene therapy pipeline development, regulatory strategy, investor relations, M&A activities, in licensing, GMP manufacturing, clinical development, and leading stakeholder and shareholder engagement. Dr. Miller has over 20 plus years of business development, scientific research, product development, and clinical operations expertise with a focus on transitioning novel gene and cell therapies through preclinical and human clinical trials. He earned his PhD in pharmacology, Bachelor of Science, and Master of Science from John Carroll University. And Dr. Miller is an avid patient-centric drug developer and entrepreneur. But Dr. Miller, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for joining Built in Ohio. And we're incredibly excited to have this conversation with you today.
Thanks for having me on. I was super excited, having been in Ohio now for over 30 years, about being built in Ohio. So I feel like I built a lot of my career. And it's always funny when you listen to some of your career background and say, wow, did I do all that stuff? I guess it's been a while. So yeah, I guess so. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, you have quite the resume, which we'll dig into. But I guess to start, we have tech pros and tech leaders from across the state in all sorts of sectors and industries, and fintech to insurtech to smart manufacturing, listening. Very smart listeners, but that is something I don't share in common with them. I'm not that smart. But let's maybe kind of start with what is gene therapy? What is gene therapies? What does that mean, kind of holistically? And then we'll kind of dive into what you're building now.
Yeah, so a really neat way to kind of start out the conversation, right? So what is gene therapy, right? So we always, when we start talking about gene therapy, we try to make sure that we all have a common ground to think about, right? So gene therapy is, trying to fix a gene that may be broken or dysfunctional in a cell, right? And when you scale that up to a patient or a human body, it's usually something that people are born with, and it's an underlying genetic condition that causes disease. And the state of the really biotechnology and the way that we're trying to approach genetic medicine is to go in and try to either replace the dysfunctional gene, with the new therapeutic approach, or trying to go in and actually edit that. That's really the kind of new edge of the field of biotechnology. But an interesting little fact, so when we start talking about gene therapy, like how long has gene therapy been around, and what are some of the big milestones in the field? The first gene that was really identified to cause a human disease was the cystic fibrosis gene. Okay, that was in 1989. Now, so for some of us, it doesn't seem like that was that long ago. Yeah. But again, looking back over our career, it was. And when you start thinking, well, it was actually discovered, one of the founders of that gene was Mitch Drum, who's a professor in genetics at Case Western. They've got a great center up there. But since then, now that we've been able to identify genes that cause disease, the therapeutic approach is to go in and say, well, how can we go in and fix them? So that's the basics of gene therapy. Lots of different ways to go in and correct. And that's what we're doing here. That's what I've spent a lot of my career on.
That's an incredible, kind of baseline. So thank you. And that answered a lot of my questions, and hopefully, that'll be a great, stage setter as we continue this conversation. But let's kind of back it up a bit so we can chat a little bit about your background and what
Sure.
we'd like to kind of see how it, not to steal from NPR, but, how you built this and what led you to it. But as I read in your bio, you obviously spent time in Northeastern Ohio at John Carroll University. Are you originally from Northeastern Ohio, or did you just go there for school? Like, what's the story there?
Yeah, I was born in Rochester, New York, and grew up there. And actually came to Cleveland to go to John Carroll to do a bachelor's degree. And actually was a dual major in biology and medieval and Renaissance studies, and had to finish that part and decide where I wanted to really build a career. And Well, I loved studying art and history, also really enjoyed science. So I went on to do a master's at John Carroll in genetics. And, back in the day when, we were still, science was a little bit of the earlier stage. PCR was a new thing, which everybody now I think knows a bit more because of COVID, right? And I continued to build, worked at a small biotech company, and also worked at the Department of Neuroscience at Case Western. But my first kind of cut my teeth in biotech in the late 90s at a gene therapy company working on gene therapy for cystic fibrosis. So went back and did my PhD, and I'll pause there to see if you have any questions, because that's when the next part of the story begins.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear that, but I was going to kind of, piggyback off of your dual majors. You could have gone on two very different trajectories there between the medieval studies and the art and history versus biotech and gene therapies. What was the kind of catalyst that then sent you on to, some more of your scientific master's, PhD, and the work you're doing today?
Well, I still love a lot of the medieval and Renaissance things, and that's more of a hobby. But if you think a little more philosophically about it, learning that part of my education taught us how to look backwards, right, and on through history, and having an appreciation for what's come before. Science is really also about trying to push forward, though. And what I wanted to do with my career was, really try to bridge the ways of marrying science with healthcare. And so I decided to go and continue to pursue, more of a healthcare type of approach through science. So, which is really where the nexus of gene therapy really starts to come in.
Yeah. And then kind of, I guess, talk a little bit after, you leave academia, you're starting to join, sounds like some biotechs. What was that kind of path or evolution? And again, as I read, you were, previously the founding CEO and president of another company. You've been, doing this and working at, other firms, other biotechs. Walk us through just a little bit about that, because I'd love to then see how that then leads to what you all are doing and building at Forge.
So when I finished my PhD, jumped right back into another gene therapy company, and that was doing gene therapy for cardiovascular disease, for peripheral vascular disease, and for wound healing. And so had learned a lot of the regulatory work, how to do preclinical studies that the FDA requires to get into a clinical trial operations, business development. So kind of the earlier days in my career were also focused on really just learning the ropes of industry. And so that really helped, I think, cut my teeth on what it really took to be a successful entrepreneur, but also, how to build up a gene therapy company. And so those were the early days. And then we get into the 2011, 2012 time point, where I actually was the founder of a company called Abeona Therapeutics, and took that public in 2015, but built manufacturing, built clinical trial operations, regulatory, global, and helped really push that to a $1 billion valuation at that particular point in time for that company. And ended up leaving that to come back and really go back to my entrepreneurial roots in many aspects, and co-found Forge with my two other co-founders.
How did that kind of that catalyst, and it sounds like, as you mentioned, that you either enjoyed or missed some of that entrepreneurial side, and so once you build up the one company, IPO'd on NASDAQ, kind of starting that process then over again, which is, it's tough to do it once, and now you're doing it, a second time. So what was kind of the inspiration or the catalyst for the Forge idea and making that leap and diving right in?
Gosh, so many ways to answer that question. I think I'll go with, when you do a startup, and I got recruited into by Drive Capital, as one of the largest VC groups right in the Midwest. And they, had a vision that I came in and we modified a bit, but it was really getting back to when you do a startup company and you've got a great venture capital backer, you're able to move pretty fast, right? And its ability to take and meet, to develop new solutions to meet some of the problems in the gene therapy space. And one of the problems that has always existed is manufacturing. And it's more, not that the manufacturing methods didn't necessarily exist, but the scale and the scope, have always been a challenge. And as the field has moved forward into new approaches for gene therapy, and just different ways that we can target a lot of these rare diseases, or even now moving into more common diseases. The scale isn't there on a global scale. Like, you can't do this globally. And I'll share with you, and we'll get to a point in the conversation today. I'll share with you an example about why Forge and others have actually a model. But to talk about the founding of the company, it was really to help meet some of those manufacturing and supply chain demands.
I love that, because one of the things that we love to talk about, and I think where a lot of Ohio's opportunity, you're literally living it, is the spaces that we're already good at and have been very good at for a really long time. And if you look at what the three C's, Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, do really well, the sectors and industries are similar. A lot of times it's financial services, insurance, healthcare, or the biospace, and then manufacturing. And so you're kind of taking the manufacturing, the biotech, and bringing that together. And I think that's an incredible Ohio story, and kind of the potential, and why we're grateful to be having this conversation, because it showcases something that our state's long been good at, but you and the Forge team are putting that 2022 spin on it. And I think that's just so fascinating, because I think there's just so much potential for Ohio, in those spaces. And again, perfect example with what you're building at Forge.
Yeah, there's been a lot of focus. I mean, Columbus has seen, a huge amount of uptick in manufacturing and companies coming here. I mean, there have been a number of announcements recently about companies coming and building plants right around Columbus. It's really, I think, pulling more people there. And really, part of what my personal goal is to help build the biotech ecosystem in the state. So, and Columbus has been a great place to do it. Cincinnati and Cleveland have a lot of pull too. But, right now, today, you're seeing just this influx of talent, influx of money, to come in to be able to get these things done. But that's really where Forge has some of its origin story.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? And I'm grateful that you brought up that point of Columbus specifically. And you mentioned, there's probably some work also happening, in the other parts of the state. But it seems like we're reading a ton, whether it's, Forge, or, groups with relations to Ohio State or Nationwide Children's Hospital. But what is kind of the I guess source, or the inspiration for some of this that's growing out? Is it, just we're getting more attention, for it, or is there, really this movement that you're sensing as well?
Well, let me give you I've got two kind of case studies for you. One will probably resonate with a lot of people listening, is that why is there, we talk about these manufacturing constraints, right? Like, why is it you can't just go into the lab, or you can't go into a manufacturing center and just make something? Well, we'll use a sneeze analogy first. It's a rough approximation, but if we were sitting across from each other right now and I had COVID, right, and I sneezed, right, a really good wet one, right, last maybe 3 seconds long, it's going to release about 100,000 viral particles. Okay. Now, these are what's called infectious, so they can replicate, when they get in. But to give you an example, right, to put it into when we think about rare disease patient dosing, for me to treat a typical rare disease patient, that sneeze, I would have to sneeze for one patient dose in a rare disease trial. I'd have to sneeze 10 million times a day for a year straight to produce that much sneeze equivalence in virus production. So that gives you one estimate on like just the capacity that's not there. And you say, well, that's really interesting, but how many bioreactors, are out there? Can you use? What type of volume do they have? And sometimes I think when trying to discuss with investors or potential partners, you say, well, don't you have like a big drum that you can just, put all this stuff in and mix it all up? You say, well, let's give you another more real example. So muscular dystrophy, there's a number of different forms. We'll talk about one of the more common ones. It's called Duchenne. So there were 10,000 patients, prevalent patients. It means that there are 10,000 existing patients in 2019. So if I wanted to treat, let's just say 25% of that population in 2023, and you say, okay, and we give a very typical dose right now in gene therapy, it would take about 47% of the existing bioreactor capacity in the entire United States just to treat 25% of one disease this way.
Wow.
So this is why groups like Forge and others have a business model, because there's such a need for that. And Forge, right now are scaling up to 5,000 liter bioreactors. So the image that you should have in your head when you think about that is, we all like to go to microbreweries, right? And you see big stainless steel vats. Forge is the only gene therapy company in the world that will have the largest bioreactors going into the second quarter. These things are 16 feet tall, okay, and we'll have 2 of them. And we have a lot of other smaller size, but that's to help meet this demand. Even with those 5,000 liter bioreactors, we would need to run 50 of them in a year, okay, 50 runs. And 1 run takes approximately 4 weeks, so about a month. So again, you work through this math and you're like, well, great. How am I going to treat the cystic fibrosis population with gene therapy? Or how am I going to treat hemophilia, or patients with sickle cell disease? Let's even think bigger. What about diabetes? This is where the field of genetic medicine really is trying to go to. And, that's how, Forge is going to help meet that in this community. Right here in
That's
Columbus.
incredible. Yeah, and that's incredible because, as you mentioned earlier, 1989 being a big focal point for a lot of this work. So I guess, that's what, about 32 or so years ago, 33. What does the next, 30 to 35 years look like? I guess both for Forge itself, but then also just the, just the biotech space, but especially within the gene therapy specifically.
Well, today, there are many diseases, and we'll use cystic fibrosis as a great example, right? We know what the gene is that causes the disease. The challenge is that there are 1,000 mutations that can happen in that particular gene that really cause disease. 5 of those mutations make up about 70 or 80% of the disease that's out there. But what about some of the diseases where we don't know what the genetic origin is? Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. How are we going to approach, genetic medicine from that aspect? Well, the field's moving. We've evolved vectors. We've evolved viruses where we scoop out the bad stuff that makes it a virus, and we use the virus as a means to deliver the therapeutic gene. Well, now, as we start to move forward into the next 10 to 20 years, it's not going to be just about giving one single injection to try to give what's considered a gene replacement strategy. Now, what we're going to start moving to is gene editing strategies, and we're going to potentially be able to use multiple viruses and multiple ways to go in and target these different diseases. So that's where the field will move, I think, of the next 5 years, much less 10 to 20.
Yeah, and I guess specifically for Forge, and I kind of pulled out a timeline because I really wanted to give our listeners and viewers just the one growth and the incredible work that you all have done, because, and if I get any of these wrong, feel free to correct me, but Forge incorporates December of 2019. So 2-3 months before we all start hearing about this coronavirus and COVID. Hire your first employee, I believe in April of 2020. So that's pretty much at the height of everything. In July 2020, you raise a $40 million Series A round. April 2021, you have a $120 million Series B, and then now in 2022, you just mentioned this facility expansion, the 5,000 liter bioreactor coming to Forge soon. And so you've had this incredible story of growth and momentum and building this company for, I would say most people, and certainly, our kind of this generation that exists now, in one of the toughest time periods that we have had. And so kudos and congratulations. But what does that next 3 years look like for Forge as you're building these bioreactors, as you're hiring new employees, as you're building these manufacturing facilities in Central Ohio? What does that look like for Forge, in these next couple years specifically?
Yeah, great question. One of the most important aspects of that is that the money is really important in bringing in really high quality investors, but it's really, we're at 180 plus people today. That's an amazing amount. We have, I think, 10 intern positions open. We've had over 500 applications, for those 10 spots.
Wow.
We've had 1,200 plus applications in the past 3 months alone for about 35 open positions. A lot of this comes down not just to, the culture, but also the mission about what Forge is really trying to do. And we have our own, we're not just a manufacturer, we actually have our own small pipeline of drugs and, really gene therapies, one of which is actually in the clinic. And so people, it's the CDMO of the soul, right? So we actually, we make and can manufacture drugs for our own therapies, but we get tied in with our patients because, we're right there on the front lines with them. We're able to engage regulatory agencies, the FDA and the EMA, for our own programs, and a lot of our potential colleagues and clients really, really like that, because it means that, hey, we're really, when we talk about everything that happens here at the Hearth, which is our facility in Columbus, we can apply that directly. Those learnings can be directly applied for them as well. So it's a huge, I think, step up in value. And as we look to the next couple of years, we'll probably be over 250 people, employees, and just continuing to grow and build.
Yeah, well, and again, incredible work. And you mentioned the money side's important, and then certainly the people, and those are two areas that our group, we don't invest, but we do things around the tech talent and building that workforce. And it's really big in the news is companies are coming to our state. And what strikes me with your all space and the biotech and the manufacturing as well is that's very capital intensive, and it's not going home and I'm building a piece of software for an app or something, and kind of the nights and weekends thing, but you need that money to start. And where some of the other tie-ins that are out there and that we talk about it across some of our other podcasts or some of our other media or just the work we do, but these innovation districts which have tie-ins to some of the work you're doing, or just drive capital, and just what a blessing that is for our state to help companies like yours get that funding to start up very early. But hopefully the success you all are having can attract more investors, and we can keep growing that out, because I think there is a real opportunity for that biotech space, certainly in Columbus, but the rest of the state too. Well, let's talk about I hear there's a clinical trial update on your pipeline therapy. If you could maybe talk a little bit about that, and what that is coming down the road as well for Forge.
So our clinical trials for patients with what's called Krabbe disease. It's a lysosomal storage disorder. It affects essentially the nerves and the myelin around the nerves. So babies that are born with this, it's a very fast progressing disease. Death often occurs by the age of 3. So, and unfortunately, in that last year and a half of life, they've lost the ability to walk. They don't make any milestones. Yeah. So it's a really horrible disease for a lot of the patients and the families that have to go through it. So we have a first of its kind in the world treatment approach, where we're doing what's called we give a systemic gene therapy. So we inject into a peripheral vein after they received a bone marrow transplant. So it's first of its kind that can do something like that. And we've seen amazing success in preclinical models. And really, when there are mice and rats and dogs that you have to go through to treat and assess the safety. So far, it's been very, very safe. It solves for some of the challenges in gene therapy because when you go through the clinical treatment, you actually have to ablate the immune system, so you remove it, and that solves for some of the immune challenges that has come under fire for some aspects of gene therapy. So we're solving for that one aspect. That in the end has some ramifications for how we think about dosing in gene therapy in a very positive way. And as we continue to move forward, we have a great enrolling center at the University of Michigan, and we're really looking forward to updating a bit more on some of the clinical trial data later this year.
That's awesome. And maybe not for this one specifically, but more broadly for these clinical trials and the work that you're doing, or even in maybe the space at large. Could you walk us through just like what that timeline is from starting it to actually rolling it out, and whatever governmental approvals you need? Because I think that's another thing where the work you're doing, it's very it's capital intensive, it's time intensive. And we all got to live through the COVID vaccine, where, that was spun up, and you'd read these articles of just about I think even the operation was like Operation Warp Speed of how quick it was. But for the space and the gene therapies that you're working in, what is kind of that timeline for some of these clinical trials from, maybe start to, when it's actually out in market with all approvals?
Yeah, if you looked at the historical data, it would be something like 8 to 10 years.
Wow.
Gene therapies and gene therapy for rare disease tends to be a little bit faster than that, somewhere maybe in the order of 5 to 8 years. But that's because in many aspects, the way that gene therapy has continued to evolve. The regulatory agencies, the clinical trial centers, have really just starting to they're getting more used to it. There's more acceptability in some approaches.
Yeah.
So we use a class of viruses called adeno-associated viruses, or abbreviated AAV. It's about 70 to 80% of the active gene therapy clinical trials that are out there use this method of gene therapy. And it's really using a virus that's been, again, we carve out the bad stuff and you put the replacement gene in. So, when we think about how long it takes, it can take, an investigator usually, or a company, 5, 8, 10 years to get to the point that they are ready to start a clinical trial. You've got to involve the FDA. You can go from a regulatory filing to have some early stage meetings, you get some guidance, you go back and do some more work, then you're able to get into the clinical trial. But from the moment you start the clinical trial, it really is going to depend. It could be something that, you've got such great safety data and efficacy data that you can do one trial and move forward to an approval. Most of the time, it's a pretty rare example. Most of the time, you're going to end up doing a small trial and then a more middle-sized trial.
Yeah. Wow. That's fascinating. And again, which, I'm not smart enough to be in biotech or have worked in it, but when we think of the innovation and just the work that's been, that happens every day, but also just, I guess looking back in human history of just how quick it's been, there's just so much to it, which, is fascinating to listen to and get to read about from time to time.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the value pieces that Forge brings into this is that it's the manufacturing aspect, because we are able to manufacture stuff from very, very early stage all the way up through toxicology and research and into clinical trials. Groups that come to work with us, they don't have to do a lot of the bridging work when you switch manufacturers all the way through. That's a huge amount of time and cost savings. So it's one of the differentiators for Forge and gene therapy.
That's great.
We serve a really important nexus point in this ecosystem.
That's awesome. So let's now move on to kind of the last third of our show, where every week when we welcome guests, we ask these same 4 questions. And so it's fun to get a founder and CEO of a biotech company. We'll have venture capitalists. We'll have, all sorts of a diverse range from all parts of Ohio. But the first one is, and we've talked about some of this now, and sometimes guests choose to answer, a really big thing, or maybe it's just part of team management and this new distributed workforce. But what is a challenge that you're working to solve, that's tech or business related? And it could be, again, as the company as a whole, or, in your role as the leader.
Well, 2-part answer, I guess, to that. Take the first one. It's the one that we discussed a little bit earlier. We are seeking to solve the problem of scale, right? If you only have smaller scale bioreactors, you're never going to be able to take that all the way to commercial. So, and there are some groups that are out there. There are probably less than 10 groups in the world that have 1,000-liter bioreactors or less. Or more. So as we think about the problem that we're trying to solve, that's one of them, is the scale of gene therapies. On a personal level, for me, it's about really building the ecosystem in biotech, here in Ohio, and, working with leadership in Cleveland, in Columbus, working with government agencies, trying to find ways that we can build workforce, we can provide more funding dollars and just more drive, to basically be able to access and grow up the ecosystem.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree more or support that, because again, as we talked about, that the healthcare, the bio side of Ohio is, it's a real opportunity, I believe, for our state. And so it's great to hear that, you all are leading that charge. But we'll go to question 2 is, a favorite read, listen, or watch. So this could be a book, a podcast, or a show. And there's no right or wrong answer. So sometimes we get the answers that people use to disconnect and forget about work for a few hours at night, or maybe it's something, that you revisit once a year that helps you be a better leader.
Well, my favorite series of books of all times is Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson's Wheel of Time, which has been made into a miniseries recently. So that was exciting. And as far as the evening, how do I de-stress? These days, it's been watching Star Wars Clone Wars, the animated series, getting ready for Kenobi coming out. Huge Star Wars fans around here at Forge, so just trying to make sure that I'm all caught up on my Star Wars knowledge and lore.
That's great. Yeah, that's a that kind of genre is a popular one, especially as I'm sure you can imagine in the tech world. But number three is, and I know it's kind of maybe a difficult one for you because you're literally living it. But what's a problem you'd solve or a business you'd start? So let's maybe take Forge. It doesn't even have to be biotech, but if funding was no issue, you got a big check and someone said, "Hey, you can tackle something no matter how tough or as much of a moonshot as it may be."
Yeah, somewhat easy one to answer, but a really hard one to actually find the solution for. There are over 7,000 rare diseases out there. 90% of them have nothing in the works, for them as a potential therapy. We saw in the past, 2 years, the government get behind, the funding and move forward with an approval for a COVID vaccine, to help save lives. Why can't we do the same thing for rare disease? There are tons of really good therapeutic approaches out there that sometimes because of a lack of funding, sometimes some regulatory issues, but why can't we put that same level of effort out there to help? Because we operate with the concept that time is the enemy. For many of these families, they have no time. So, that's the problem that I would love for us to, if I had a moonshot, that would be it.
Yeah. And I love that too. I think, I think the COVID vaccine is a perfect example because, we all, especially in this, the joke used to be in like politics or government, it was a 24-hour news cycle, but now it's, by the tweet, and we have these short attention spans. But, some of these, putting a man on the moon was, one generation's big thing.
Right.
Why can't we do more of that?
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah. So fourth and final one that we always end with, but what is your favorite place in Ohio? So maybe I'll kind of do two parts. So your personal favorite, but as you're building your company, recruiting, talent, if you're trying to show off or showcase Central Ohio or Columbus or wherever it might be, where are you taking people for dinner? What are you kind of doing to sell it? So both your personal favorite and then, what Forge perhaps does to get people to move here.
Well, I would say places that I personally love to go is any one of the, parks. Ohio's done a really great job, making state parks, and love to get out and hike. So as an avid mountain climber, one of the things that we do sometimes with the Forge team and others is we'll go and do a disease awareness climb. So on a personal level, anytime I can get out into one of the parks, that's great. In Columbus, there's a number of great areas. I have a place in the short north, so usually when we're bringing people in to recruit, we'll often go out to dinner and have fun and just basically show people around the town. So it's a great area.
That's great. Well, I have to ask a follow-up on the mountain climbing. What do you have big ones you've checked off or ones you're working towards? Where do you stand there?
Yeah, so we've done a number of climbs. We did a rare disease awareness climb for a disease called Sanfilippo syndrome.
Okay.
Where we climbed and summited Mount Rainier with a couple of rare disease advocates and families. We also did a Pico de Orizaba down in Mexico, which is 18,500. So that was another family disease awareness climb that was really, really successful. So we've done Mount Baker, Mount Adams.
Yeah.
And there are some in the team that really want to try to do Denali, which is Alaska. So when you're preparing for Everest, usually what your last three summits are Mount Rainier, Mount Denali, and then you want to move on to Everest. So don't have any desire to do Everest, but some of the team really wants to go and try Denali. And otherwise, we'll see what else we bring this summer. Stay tuned because hopefully we'll have another mountain climb and some pictures from on our website around that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. To me, that's one of those hobbies or passions. It's like, how do you make that leap from going on the weekend maybe to Colorado and doing a nice little hike to Denali, and there's that whole path in between that makes it fascinating.
Yeah, we one of the moments in the past probably several years that stood with me was on Mount Rainier. Actually, we were up. It was 2:00 in the morning. We were just starting to get ready to do the ascent climb. We were at about 10,500 feet, and our little group was the last group in the big climb party. We all have our headlamps on and it's dark and you're walking across the glacier and you're looking up at the mountain. You can't really see it yet, but what you could see was the headlamps of all the people in front of you. And it was a really profound moment because you're just, again, we're on a rare disease climb, and you're just trying to remember and reflect on all of the families, scientists, and clinicians that had come before us just to get to that point, and still realizing that there was still a mountain to climb. So hopefully, Forge is helping to, and the team here is really helping to climb more of those mountains.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. And again, we could probably do another podcast just on all that, which is fascinating. But Dr. Miller, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. Anything that we didn't touch on that you did want to get across, or if not, how can people learn more about Forge and maybe career opportunities or whatever it is?
Sure.
So your chance to share anything here.
Well, Chris, thanks so much for having me on, and love the conversation. If people wanted to learn more about Forge, you can go to our website, forgebiologics.com, and there's a careers page. We are actively hiring. So by all means, we'd love to meet you.
Great. So we'll link both about Forge, the career space specifically, so people can, if you're looking, Apple Podcast, Spotify, you can just click off. As we link also off of LinkedIn and others, go check out their LinkedIn page, give them a follow. Sounds like incredible, exciting stuff that has been happening, of course, but then also to come. So we'll have to follow along and maybe even see some great mountain hiking pictures as well. So Dr. Miller, thank you so much for joining. This has been another great episode of Built in Ohio with a fantastic story that I really enjoyed today. So thank you again for being here. Thanks to everyone for listening and watching, and we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Chris.